Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2013 Advanced. In this section we're going to start to look at programming in VBA, Visual Basic for Applications. If you're not a programmer already and you're maybe a little bit scared of programming and you think it's something you're not really going to be able to get to grips with, I would really urge you not to just skip the next few sections and move on to the next section that looks as though it's not to do with programming, because I do think you'll find that if you give programming a little bit of a try, your use of Microsoft Access is going to benefit a lot from learning even basic VBA. I also need to give a little word of warning to those of you who've done some programming and maybe even some VBA. Maybe you're pretty expert at VBA. You've used it in Excel or Word or another member of the Office suite. I really am going to start VBA from the beginning here. I'm going to do it really quite quickly, but not too quickly for new people, so you may find the next 2 or 3 sections a little bit slow if you're used to using VBA. But I should warn you also that within those first few sections I will be looking specifically at some aspects of VBA that are related to Microsoft Access. So we'll be looking at some of the commands that are used when you're programming in Access using VBA. So there may be a little bit of a danger you might miss something important if you just skip the first 2 or 3 sections on the basis that you know VBA already. On the other hand, if you do know it, you've used it in Access before, then by all means join in about 3 or 4 sections time as we start to get into some aspects of VBA for Access that are more related to the later versions, such as Access 2013. Now, you may have heard of the language BASIC before, you may have heard of the language Visual Basic before, and you may well have heard of Visual Basic for Applications. Visual Basic for Applications is a version of the Visual Basic language that was developed by Microsoft to use in its applications. These applications include Word, Excel, Access, PowerPoint, and so on. Now, the idea of having a programming language is that there are certain tasks within the application which can be automated. And there can be various reasons for automating those tasks, including repeating a task many times or executing a very long, possibly quite complex sequence of steps automatically and without any human intervention. Now, typically when you start developing applications in Microsoft Access, much of what you do is automatic. You design forms, you put buttons on forms, you maybe design reports, and you don't really have to get involved in writing your own program code. Now, there is program code there, but Access uses its standard program code all the time. So if you take this college student database, for example, when I click on the Students button there and the student list is made up, that can usually be achieved by Access without you having to write any code of your own, anything that's different from the code that Access has built into it. But if you want to do something slightly different, if you want things to happen in a particular way or in a different way, if you want to click a button to do something that is not a standard action, then you need to write some program code to do it. And you basically have 2 choices. You can write program code in the form of a macro, or you can write VBA code. We've already looked at macros earlier on in the course, and you can do a lot with macros. So you could, for instance, do all sorts of things when you press a button. Not only could you assemble some data, but you could save some data, you could run a report, all kinds of things. And you shouldn't ever underestimate how useful and powerful Access macros are. But macros can't do everything. They can do actually a relatively small subset of what is possible in Microsoft Access. If you want to do pretty much anything, if you want to write code to achieve almost anything that's possible in Access, you need to use VBA. One of the problems with adopting the approach of using macros is that if you say have a fairly straightforward task to do, you write a macro to do it, everything seems fine. If that task then becomes a little bit more complicated, if another requirement comes in, if you want to do something even more out of the ordinary, you may well get to a point where you can't do it with a macro and you have to write VBA code. At that point, you may somewhat regret your decision to start out by using macros. Now, I don't want to put anybody off using macros. This is more of a word of warning. If you want to limit yourself to macros, that's fine, although every now and then you'll come across something that you can't do. But if you really want to be able to develop your skills in Access to the maximum, then I suggest you adopt the policy of using VBA whenever possible. Another advantage of writing VBA code is that VBA code is more transportable. Now, to be fair, you're not going to be able to take VBAs written for Access and use them directly in a SQL Server database. But the structure of the code and the way that it's written in VBA is something that's much more likely to be transportable to use in a product such as Microsoft Visual Studio, which also uses Visual Basic, and where switching from Access to Visual Studio might be really quite a small step, whereas if you've written something using an Access macro, then I'm afraid you're probably going to be starting, to all intents and purposes, from scratch again. So let's now adopt the policy that we're going to do a number of things using VBA, and I'm going to combine showing you some of the features of Access, some new features hopefully, and how you can achieve them using VBA, with also teaching you the basics of VBA. Now, learning VBA takes quite a lot longer than learning macros because there's actually an awful lot of peripheral information, and there are many options, as you'll see, for some things. I don't want to frighten you off. I don't want you to expect this to all suddenly get horribly complicated, because I'm going to try to avoid that. But the power of VBA resides in the fact that it's a very flexible and powerful language, and therefore there are a lot of different aspects of it that you might want to get to grips with. However, as I will try to show, getting the basics started is pretty straightforward, and you can develop your skills in it over a period of time. And the best way to do that, as always, is to actually use it to do some specific jobs. So I'm going to give you a couple of exercises to do as we go along. So let's start with that macro we wrote some time ago. MCR Hello World, it's a macro. You should remember it. Let's go into Design View now. Go into Design View, opens the macro editor there, and you can see message box. The text in the message box is Hello World. Beep yes. What type of message? Informational. What's the title? Our first macro. Let me just close that. Let's run that. You remember we can run it by double clicking it. Up comes the message Hello World. Click on OK. It's over. Now let's convert that macro to VBA code and see what the equivalent VBA code looks like. So when you're in Design View for a macro, you get a contextual tab in the macro tools, a Design tab, and one of the options in the Tools group is Convert Macros to Visual Basic. So let's click that. We have a security notice here because this involves using one of the Access Wizard tools. Safe enough. Click on Open. Convert the macro MCR Hello World. Do you want to add error handling to generated functions? Yes. And do you want to include any macro comments that are there? Yes. Let's click on Convert. Now when the conversion is finished, you get a message Conversion Finished, and you are now in the Microsoft Visual Basic for Applications editor. And the first thing I need to do is to explain this editor to you, because you're going to be seeing a lot of this. So the Visual Basic editor is in the form of a window, and you use this window in order to manage and develop code, VBA code, that you're going to use in your Access applications. Now the VBA editor does not use the ribbon interface. It uses the traditional style of menu interface. So we have along the top a File menu, an Edit menu, a View menu, and on the View menu one of the options is Toolbars, As you can see, there's a list of toolbars. There's a debug toolbar, an edit toolbar, a standard toolbar that's shown, and a user form toolbar. More on one or two of those later as well. And the standard toolbar, the one that you can see here, we're going to use for a variety of reasons from now on while we're working on our VBA code. Now what I'm aiming to do here is to take you through the main features of the VBA editor so that we can get started. Without going into everything in too much detail, I'm going to add the detail as we go along. The first window I want to look at is the Project Explorer. See the name here, Project Student Database 1. Now there's a close button there. Let me just close it first. That's now closed the Project Explorer. To open it again, go to View and just View Project Explorer. The Project Explorer is a structured hierarchy within the current project or projects. Now the project in this case is Student Database, so I've clicked on that point in the hierarchy. And within that we have a sort of folder type structure. We have Microsoft Access class objects. Let's just expand that by clicking on the plus sign. Collapse it with the minus. And then we also have modules. There are two modules. There's something called Converted Macro MCR Hello World. You might be able to guess what that is. And another thing called Mod Mapping. Let's collapse that down. Now by default, below the Project Explorer we have the Properties window, and the Properties window lists the properties of the object that we have selected in the Project Explorer. So for instance, if I say go down in the structure in the Project Explorer to form_frm about and select that, what we have here are the properties of that. Now I don't expect you to understand these properties at the moment. I'm going to talk about some of these later on. But basically, as you select objects up here, if those objects have properties, visible properties, then you'll see those properties appearing in the list down here. The properties window can also be closed, and to open it again, go to the View tab, click on Properties window, and it's back again. Note that many of these have keyboard shortcuts as well. At the bottom right we have the Immediate window. The use of the Immediate window will be a little bit clearer later on, but basically when you're working on code, if you want to try something out immediately, maybe check the status of something, maybe you're testing and debugging some of your code, you'll see the use of the Immediate window lets you take a look at how things are at a moment in time and maybe try something out. Just run one command and see what happens. You'll see more of that later on. Now on the upper right we have the Code window, and the Code window is the one that contains the code. As you're developing your VBA code, you'll be entering it into this window. You'll be making changes to it as you gradually develop what it is doing, and when you find out that it isn't doing what you want it to, this is where you'll edit it, to change it, to fix it, to debug it, to stop it doing the wrong things and make it start to do the right things. Now at the moment, if you look in the Project Explorer, you can see that what's selected is Converted Macro MCR Hello World. When we converted that old macro into VBA code, it produced this code. So this code is the equivalent of that macro. Some of the lines in it, like this one, message box, hello world, VB information, our first macro, you can probably work out what that does. Indeed, the line above it, beep, you can probably work out what that does. But some of the others may look slightly like gobbledygook at the moment, and I'm going to explain one or two of those in the next section. So I'll see you then.